have the fun opportunity to talk with folks like our speaker today, Matthew Cicanese. I hope you've had an opportunity to go out into the nature gallery and see some of Matthew's photos. Matthew was actually out in the nature gallery today, meeting and greeting various guests and talking to them about his passion for lichens and photography. Today we're here to learn about lichens, these weird and incredibly diverse organisms that play some critical roles on our planet. In addition to their striking beauty, lichens offer innovation in pharmacology, medicine, research, human health. They also play a role in many traditional cultures. As I mentioned, Matthew's newest exhibition, Symphonies and Scale Lichens, has been on display here in the Nature Gallery since February. It's been a wonderful addition. And as we're still living through COVID, it's a wonderful opportunity to be outside and in nature. And that's something that we encourage all of our guests to do, is make sure that you're not just hanging out inside the museum, but also taking time to go out to the forest and see what we have to offer outdoors. A Canon photographer, Forbes 30, National Geographic Explorer, and fellow in the International League of Conservation Photographers, Matthew's work exists in the intersection of art and science. His stories have been featured in esteemed publications, including Photo District News, BBC Earth, New Scientist, and the cover of World Wildlife magazine. So I would ask that you please mute or turn off your cell phones or devices to avoid any interruptions during the talk. And please join me in giving a hearty, affirming welcome to Matthew Cicanese.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming this afternoon. And Bobby, thank you so much for the opportunity to share my work with the Fernbank community. Since the beginning of February, my work has been here in the Wildwoods, and I have the thankfulness to visit it today for the first time. And it's good to hear that some of you have seen it in person as well. Chapter 1, we're going to take a quick look back at my origins. This is me at square one, 1 year old. Survived a really bad sickness, but came out the other side ready to work. The difference is I had lost my hearing and my sight in half and half. So this whole time as a kid growing up, I knew that I loved to be outside, and I knew that I was really connected with the world around me and loved insects and bugs that were in my backyard. But I always had this disconnect. I was looking at the things that were right in front of my nose and often ignoring the problems that were in the background as a generation with a lot of things happening to our ecosystem. And what I found over time was the more I pushed myself to challenge myself outside the limits of how I saw and navigated the world, like this flying sidekick in karate. I was the youngest person in the class and they barely wanted to let me in, but a couple years later, after 8 tries, I kicked the board in half. And I think that the same goes for my different interests, because as a kid, I had a million different interests. At one point, I probably wanted to be a chemist. And along the way, I got every merit badge imaginable, becoming an Eagle Scout at the end of my high school career. And what this taught me all along the way is different tastings, different things I was excited to explore and learn more about. And this image just so happens to be my very first macro photograph. And I took this in my backyard. This was really surprising to me because up to that point, my backyard was just kind of the same old thing. And when I had put a camera up to eye, it kind of made the rest of the world just melt away. Those sensory losses in vision and sound that I had suddenly focused in a different way, and the world made more sense. Flash forward a little bit, I pursued a science degree, wondering, is science for me? How deep do I want to go down the science wormhole? Thankfully, I learned a ton about lichen science, but I didn't become a lichenologist, a lichen scientist. I don't think that was for me, but the research I did was new in some ways and pushing the limits, once again, of how I was approaching the things I did. Flash forward to commencement at my graduation in 2012, and I spoke about failure and how failure is a wonderful tool for exploration and curiosity. And then when I got to Duke, everything changed because I started telling people, look at this species in the frame. Isn't it so sciencey and cool? Nobody really cared. People wanted to know why I was out there. They wanted to know how I found myself in these places that put these kind of images on the right onto the page. And I was seeing my work tangibly, holding it for the first time. I was also having a little more fun with my work because I think up until this point, everybody would ask, what species is that you're showing us and what does it do chemically? And I could never just have a conversation about it. So when I started having more fun with some of the images and places I went and were creating, everything started to piece together in different little pieces along the way. This was the first time I went to National Geographic headquarters and saw how my work as a Big Cats Initiative intern was kind of being put to use practically. I was also there for a conference and got to see in the halls some of the really fascinating images that had reached beyond the magazine, whatever magazine it was. I just knew storytelling. It's this really cool thing, but we can never translate it from A to B. And seeing it like this told me the opposite, and I was excited. Little did I know, years later, I'd be arm wrestling one of my, more greater heroes in conservation, photography, and storytelling, but that's a story for another time. I jumped back in head first deep, going through some scholarships and research opportunities, and end up on the other side with a master's and my work on the wall. Not quite as big as this slideshow, but I'm getting there. So it was exciting to see the work this big and the lichen in the frame he's looking at there, because I realized, what does it look like when we take something that's the size of a pencil eraser and make it the size of this microphone or this podium or that screen? How does it change the conversation we have about these species? And when he's looking at this species on the wall, what conversation does it say about this work and the work it represents when it's then put in front of an audience of general type? This was in an everyday magazine for photographers, and most people who are nature photographers would probably just walk right on these types of lichens. These are called British soldiers, and they're a Cladonia species. They're actually pretty sensitive to pollution. And unbeknownst to me, it was awarded. I had applied to an Environmental Photographer of the Year, thinking this is a macro image. It's kind of abstract. I don't know if it tells a bigger story in the way I hope it can. And that community helping me realize it could was some fuel for the fire. So I wrapped up that degree with my master's, ready to go out into the world as a storyteller, and my first stop was Iceland. I went there on a National Geographic grant with my partner in life, Eric Reiter, and we traveled over 1,500 miles around Iceland's Ring Road to look at the different Icelandic lichen species. Now, there's some really beautiful things in Iceland. These are flowers in a volcanic field, and among these places, even if they look barren, all you have to do is stop and look a little closer, and through the mist, you'll see beneath your feet something magical. So rocks like this may start off very barren, but over time, as the land morphs and shifts, life comes to these rocks and they become a living organism and start breaking down pieces of the puzzle that make up these places we know. So oftentimes these barren rock are covered with things that might look like paint or other things, but it's life, and it's life that is thriving and helping the environment. So many people would see a space like this and they'd wonder what's there, if anything, beyond the flowers and grasses. But again, getting closer to the rocks underfoot, looking around and asking, how can we look at our world a little different in this one moment? This is Kirkjufell, or Church Mountain. This is over in the western peninsula of Iceland. And it was one of these wonderful places to just stop and marvel again at the beauty and detail. I kind of gave you a ping pong of different images from Iceland because I think I took about 25,000 images. This was on black velvet, and it was just a loose chunk of lichen because they don't have roots. If you notice the structures on the bottom, that's from the mosses and the other things growing. But those lichens, they're just kind of resting throughout that medium. And I set it on the black velvet like that so we could appreciate how it looks when it's taken out of this puzzle resting on top of the soil. This was the midnight sun. We were in Iceland 3 a.m. in the morning sometimes at different spots. It was really interesting to see the equivalent of kind of like a coral reef on land. And Iceland has so much to offer with these different species. One of the things I love to see along the way is most people do are the waterfalls. And a challenge for this is that those people are walking on things like this to get to that waterfall. So it's a very interesting process, learning to see more detail around you, but then also learning to, I guess, not let it bother you and, like droves of people keep using side trail instead of the official trail. And I can see things this beautiful from a mile away, and then they walk right over them. So a lot of times they'll be fine, but there are some really sensitive lichen species. If any of you, I'm sure, have probably seen the movie Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, there were things like this growing on the ground, generally speaking, and stuff like that can be really sensitive, so they'd even have to build scaffolding. This is a fun one. On our road around Iceland, we saw this tractor in a field, and it had these lichens growing all over the tractor itself. So if you notice the rusted seat there in the background, this reminds me of how lichens can survive the vacuum of space. So it makes me think, if they can survive outside the International Space Station, how might they colonize new planets in places we've yet to discover? Here it is again, the tire of that same tractor, and up close we have a beautiful array of different lichen species. Again, coral reefs on land. As soon as I saw these as an undergraduate student, I fell in love, and I knew that wherever I went, it was kind of like a puzzle. How can I find lichens, and how are the people there connected to them? This is the town of Húsavík, and it's in northern Iceland in central north. And in the town of Húsavík, there's a marina. And curious enough, around that marina, the salty brine of the ocean and the sea spray, there were lichens thriving. So around the chains, at the Whale Museum, this is a collected bone, not a poached bone. This is a whale jawbone, and on that whale's jawbone, there's just a cacophony of life. So sometimes I even get lost for words when I see it, because it melts away everything else. And this is moss. These aren't lichens, but throughout that moss and the pillowy lava fields, there are lichens hiding. So it was really something to think about. All this lava flows out onto the land of ice and fire, in this case, Iceland. And it tells the story of really any ecosystem, because when those volcanoes go off, it's just barren rock. It may get covered in moss or lichens. It may get covered in flowering plants, but most of the time, those lichens are the ones to show up first. Again, these are sensitive species, and we had the opportunity to meet an ethnobotanist, somebody who studies how plants are used in cultures. And this ethnobotanist taught us that this Parmelia lichen that she collects very gingerly and makes sure she doesn't over-harvest, she uses that in a very traditional way to dye the Icelandic wool a traditional Viking brown. So this traditional color was used when the settlers first arrived, and some of the other lichens in her basket even helped the settlers survive events like major volcanic eruptions. So a lot of these lichens are quite literally what helped drive the culture and the very clothes on the people's back around the world. Now the lichen that made the yarn colored is in the bottom. The other ones around the edge are some of the other natural dyes she uses, but I didn't want anyone to get their hopes up about a blue lichen dye. I haven't heard that. These are some of her other yarns, and the lichen prominent ones are right in the middle there, right? And this is her home studio. She's since moved to a better facility with more resources and education materials, because she does workshops for lichen education. So the yarn you saw, these dye pots on the tables, they're heated to a certain temperature. And for a lot of these yarns, she puts powdered copper in them. And it's to simulate how they used to use copper pots for dyeing wool. So she really does go all the way back to the historic source for how people use lichens in this way, and how they can tell something about the culture of Iceland and Icelandic clothing. So Iceland was definitely a mystery revealed to me, not knowing too sure what to expect, but thankful for the opportunity to travel there in 2016 with the help of a National Geographic Young Explorer grant. So this, in combination with a couple other organizations, took us around the map to a lot of different points, and over the course of a few weeks, I took about 25,000 images. So I'm excited to say it's one of my favorite trips, and I've been back since and gone to some really cool places, including this tiny island right down here called Surtsey. So I didn't bring any Surtsey stories with me this time, but that'll be for next time. Now we're going to travel on to Sri Lanka at the southern tip of India. Sri Lanka is a country with very beautiful ecosystems like this rainforest in the Sinharaja rainforest. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site and Biosphere Reserve, and it's home to countless endemic species, most of the species in Sri Lanka that are only found in Sri Lanka. And when Erica and I were over there with this National Geographic scientist, we were going to places like this cloud forest and Porton Plains, another really important and protected area. And we were seeing some really beautiful species like this one up close, species that were blue and black and red and orange like I had never seen before. Even species that I had no clue were even a lichen. And the interesting part to me was I'm roughly in the same general vicinity around the equator, and it was such a fun time to see some of these subtropical and tropical species that kind of reminded me of home, but then were a little different. That's a Cococarpia, the blue one. These little finger-like ones sticking out, looking up a tree trunk. You can see it's really just a micro city. I like to think of them as worlds within worlds. And this is a perfect example. This is a single leaf in that rainforest. And you can see all of the different molds, bacterias, slimes, and of course lichens growing on top of this leaf surface, like paint on a canvas. When the leaf falls from the tree, game over. If you look really closely, you might see a little insect in the top left. Draw a comma on a piece of paper, and that's a candy-striped springtail that moves at about a mile a minute. So I was really thankful to have this shot because it was there for a single frame and gone in the other four. So, oh, you guys got a double. Now you get to know which ones I really, really like. So, again, this is blue Cococarpia. Common question I get is, what are those pink blotches in the middle? The rough answer is they're kind of like pollen on a flower. They're called cephalodia, and on some species they do some things and they do other things, but they lock onto nitrogen. That's one thing that all of them do. So when they fix that nitrogen, that's really important to the ecosystem, big picture. This is a landscape view of one of the places we went, Sri Lanka, giving you an idea of some of the other sites that we'd see. I'm thankful to say that our whole team is still together in one piece after we heard some howler monkeys in one spot, and Erica was away from the group. And yeah, leopards are pretty big, right? So it was good to see a place like this. It was also humbling to be told, if you hear certain sounds, you need to make sure you're with the group because you are in a wild space, and there are things that aren't as friendly as lichens. Because I'd be at the base of the street and I'd just disappear into thought, and a lot of times I won't even hear the scientist call my name kind of thing, depending on what was going on. So these are some eucalyptus trees that are growing over there agriculturally, and there's beautiful lichens among them. Pretty cool for me to see those. I didn't expect those there. These are ones specific to a tea estate that we visited. The Dilma Conservation is the other org that we were partnering with, and this is actually a lichen that is named after Dilma. So I'm not going to butcher the scientific name, but it's pretty cool to have seen this flower. They call it a flower for this shape on this particular species. Now, translating it to the real world, this is a screen grab of a tear sheet, one of the editorial articles in Photo District News, PDM. And this was how photographers help scientists see differently. If you see the image on the left we saw a few frames ago, and the scientist on the right in the mist where we saw that image, paints a picture of this missing link between the science world and the storytelling world. This is looking up from the ground where I was observing some of those lichens in Sri Lanka in the cloud forest, and it was really interesting because bright and sunny in this frame, but not a minute later, it was like a dark storm had rolled over because of the cloud forest. As a matter of fact, right before this picture, it was cracking lightning everywhere. And this lichen here is used a wide-angle lens, so it looks a little bigger proportionally, but it's probably about that big around, half the size of my head. I've never seen a single specimen that size. Of course, the lichens like this were all in part collected by the scientists and other researchers we were with and documented based on what was happening in that ecosystem at the time. This is a specimen growing on some different specimens growing on a sheep skull, I think. And this is an archival teaching tool over in London. And that's the scientist Hans who we worked with in Sri Lanka. All right, now we're gonna go around a bit of North America. I grew up in Florida, and most of what I know and love in terms of bumping into things involved stuff like this on the tree. And I'm like, why is there blood on the tree? No, it's not blood, it's just a crust lichen that happens to be red. Same for this, period on the sentence or big fat dot on the letter I. That's how big each of these whole circles are, the black circles. So, thinking about how much can really fit into a postage stamp and how to show it in a way that, I don't know, sometimes it reminds me of Jackson Pollock, just experiencing it. And then I try and get the light to hit it in a way that it's not so boring, because a lot of the images from this world can be really flat, without shadow, without as much texture, and limited technology for how we can document them. But with some of these new cameras and probably 15 plus years of lighting and tinkering and playing, I've figured out how to make these look more touchable, more lifelike. The Christmas lichen on the right with the pink rim looks like it can jump off the page. It's gonna get you more interested probably. And I thought, how lifelike can I make these? Maybe someday they'll jump right off the canvas digitally. But for now, I love the mesmerizing nature that they create and the questions that they bubble up. Because people ask me, how can something be that pink? Matt, you photoshopped that, didn't you? Not a lick. I did the contrast, a bit of sharpness, a little bit of shadow, didn't pump the color. This is what the camera sees and what the eye can see if you look close enough and slow down. Again, same species, slightly different lighting, and it's a completely different experience. So the question becomes, how can I show these in different ways that gets people to start looking at the world around them, wherever they're at, even right out here in the wildwoods, even right out in the parking lot. I bet I can find some cool lichens. This is a palm frond. On the far left, the little green smudge, that's moss or a liverwort. And one rung over, that's a lichen. So even in the folds of the palm frond down in the palmettos in Florida, these things are figuring out how to survive and thrive. Now this is a cool one. The image in the middle shows a tiny little cocoon. Remember that period on your sentence? This is probably about the same size for that chrysalis in the middle. And the lichens on the right that are really bright red, they're endemic to southeast US, and they're only found on sable palms, on those offshoots that stick off all palm trees. The lichen on the left is called mustard powder. That's the nickname for it. And scientific genus is Chrysothrax. So I didn't become a lichenologist, but I like to know enough technical bits to get me from point A to point B, learning the stories behind these. Because a lot of times I won't know quite what I'm looking at, and I'll have to do some research or collaboration. And that's a big part of storytelling a lot of people don't really think about. The one from a few slides ago, the black circles, this is one of those really, really, really close. So I used a near microscopic lens for this one. And this was probably, yes, it was. This was stacked. So if you've ever had a CT scan and know how they kind of slice all those different layers of focus, this was probably 30 to 50 images of focus all squashed together in a focus sandwich. Otherwise, it would just be a razor thin hairline at one time. Another Christmas lichen. This one's fun because it reminded me of Iceland. It looks pretty close to the map of Iceland. I've had some fun with my work over the years, thinking about ways I can play with cutting that lichen out, pairing it with a map. This is the cap of an acorn. And even on the cap of an acorn, there are lichens that are finding a way to grab on, hold somehow. This is a foliose lichen, which that means it's leafy. And I just want to point out really quick, right under here, they've got these little fingers, and they grab on with those little fingers. And that's how the leaflet on the lichen holds on. Turn it off. Save your ears. Okay. Let's see, back. This is in the pines of Florida. So more Cladonia species, bright red tips on them, and just an alien world. Like normally I like everything to be kind of like this, tack sharp, focus, and seeing detail front to back. But I've started to learn to love things like shadow and focus, and learn to use those selectively to tell a more fun story. I think fun's a big factor for my work that I used to just kind of hide behind facts. But I think fun and facts can mix together to make a really magical experience. This was a trail I had been on in Florida before, never stopped and thought twice about some of these logs, and got low and thought slow and ran into this. These are powderhorn Cladonia. And it was really something to see Haida Gwaii off the coast of British Columbia. Went there with a moss researcher, a bryologist. I won't hold it against her. She still likes lichens though. And it was places like this that I got to see some peat bogs and some other really interesting species mixed with the lichens. You can see the sticky sundew at the very top, and some peat moss all around in the background, some flowering plants on the right, and then our little friend the lichen right in the middle. This is in my childhood backyard. It's a rope with a swing, and you get close enough on it, you're going to notice that there it is, the Christmas lichen growing in between the fibers of that very rope. I had the opportunity to visit the Red Rocks out in Las Vegas a few years back, and little did I know that I'd see such a colorful array. Figured I'd see some gray and white here and there, but it was lichen heaven, and I was so excited to see so many different colors and patterns for such a dry, desolate, and challenging ecosystem. And this is a place I like to call home. This is one of the trails I frequent every week, almost every day. And this is one of the places that I think about day to day, pretty much. It's very Jurassic World, very Jurassic Park. I like Jurassic Park more than Jurassic World, for the record. I know I'm recording this. Very Jurassic Park. And this really, I mean, to be honest, I didn't know this trail was here until a few years ago. And I fell in love because, I mean, there's so much to see. And even these wooden fences, lichens on the other side of them, all on the flanks. So it's a place literally a few minutes from where I need to be, and it's a place I can reach to at any given time. One of my favorite images of lichens that features an animal, wildlife, is this twig ant with a little treasure in its mouth. She's carrying a springtail, and she's navigating this twig in a South Florida wetland. And this strap lichen, southern strap lichen, Usnea, or Ramalina stenosporum. Usnea is the bushy one. Ramalina is the strap one. When she was going through this, she would disappear and reappear, and it was like watching an ember catch flame. And I was so thankful to get a shot because each of these is just a fraction of a second. Kind of like that leaf with the springtail crawling across. So this image is a place close to home and close to the heart. And it's done a lot in terms of getting people interested and fascinated in the world that's held on to me for 15 years now. Last series I wanted to share today with you is a series called Ghosts, and it's one I've worked on for quite a while. It's a fun little game of hide and seek that I like to bump into a lot. Sometimes the games are easier than others, and this one has a caterpillar somewhere in the frame. It's typically a little harder to see at different distances, but if you look close enough, it's right in the middle of the frame along that border that's cutting the slide in half. Its head is right in half. Here we've got lichen praying mantis on a young oak tree in central Florida. again, right in my own backyard. I would have never expected to find this. And now I find myself every time I go to visit family, just staring at the trees. And sometimes they're, Matthew, what are you doing over there? But the funny part is, sometimes I stare at stuff that's a little scary, like this lichen huntsman spider. I'm not the biggest fan of spiders, but I do respect that it blends in pretty darn well. And the fun part is, you know, when you think you see something and you're not sure, and then the wind blows again and maybe it's a leaf that time. Well, other times, maybe it's not. Maybe it's a caterpillar blending in again pretty effortlessly with its surroundings. Oh, sorry, guys. My right eye is my dominant eye. I told myself I'd read from here, and yet I keep looking over there. So I'm going to come back to here. Here we are in Sri Lanka, another ghost. This is a leafhopper insect, and this one's a little difficult. But if you look right in the middle and to the right, you can see. And then its head is right here. This lichen huntsman spider was seen in Sindharaja National Park. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it's in Sri Lanka. It's a protected jungle habitat, and this spider was the coolest version of camouflage that I've ever seen. Get back a little further, and it's a little easier to see, but it blends in pretty much effortlessly with this lichen on the bark. And when the scientists we were working with pointed this out to us, I was fascinated. I was a little terrified, but I was still fascinated. Handful of frames later, and we got this image. Fun story about this one, you'll notice the shadows are pretty dramatic in the other ones. The flat light in this one helps you see just how well it can blend in. How big, oh boy.
I mean, are we
How
talking
big's
like
the spider?
$1 or like $1?
Probably the length of my hand. I wasn't happy, but I was excited. Well, guys, I'm a little rough around the edges. I was going to have a little better of a special thanks here, but generally speaking, there's a lot of people in my life to thank, from my partner Erica to Bobby and the team here at Fernbank, and everybody in between, from friends and family, you guys who came out today. Lichens are a constant fascination for me, and this is just the tip of the iceberg this first 15 years. So I'm going to actually be announcing some little bits here and there in the next few weeks. I'm putting my first book together for this summer release. So it's going to only feature lichens. I'm really excited because I'm working with some of my editors from over the years who have watched this journey most of the way and are excited to see what comes next. So thank you all for your time. This has been wonderful. I know we're a little early for how long I normally stretch my talks, but I am happy to answer any and all questions you guys have. And afterwards, I've got a meet and greet outside of the lot. So thank you so much. The question was, what kind of camera do I use? I use Canon cameras for my system, and the type of camera I use has a really big brain behind it. So it's a really big Canon R5, and it's got a really big sensor for the canvas. So that's how I get these zoomable images.
Film?
No, so this is all digital, and the best part about that is I have shot film, but that's incredibly challenging, particularly for macro.
Yeah.
So the beauty of digital is it's easier on the species and everything in between. Thank you. That's a great question. Mm-hmm. The question was, what kind of elements do I look for when I visit a new place to kind of dial in my focus for that spot and find cool things like this? The first thing I love to do is suspend disbelief. If you have preconceived notions about the place that you're visiting, you're going to come out with kind of a set of how you're going to think about it. I try to go in with a blank slate and just see what's going to present itself to me. So today in the Wildwoods, for example, I walked along on the boardwalk and I tried to see what lichens I could see. And I was looking at things that were typically starting at the height of my eyes, whether you're just a kid or really tall, starting with eye height and then asking yourself, I wonder what's under my feet, or I wonder what's just above me. Or, if you're holding a pebble or a twig, I wonder what's on the other side. I was a kid that running around in my backyard, one of my hobbies was quite literally flipping over rocks and logs, seeing what was there and flipping them back over. So I think that a healthy level of curiosity with a good amount of ethics makes sense, because I've seen some really bad stuff for flipping over logs to see what's there. But that curiosity can lead to, finding these moments in nature that are really creative. I call this one disco fever. So. But I think to sum it up, it would be, finding elements of art that we know in our everyday life. If it's, the still life of our fruit sitting out, if it's the flowers we bought for a loved one, seeing the different textures and colors, shapes and lines and different forms that creativity can take, even if it's right in front of us, like the pattern on this microphone. I'm a little weird. I'm kind of neurodiverse. I'm ADHD, and I see an extreme level of detail and stuff. I think that weirdness is translated into deep focus. So I would say really just kind of find what grabs you out of those creative things and just lean in deep, So some of the people I've talked to, they're like, I can't see my garden the same way again. I'm just looking at this type of one flower, or I'm watching this one fallen log change every season. Just taking their awareness and looking at it through a different perspective, having fun with it. I think that's the best way to bump into stuff like this.